I'm really pleased today to be talking with Omid Tofighian from Sydney. Omid is a philosopher, actually of classical Greek philosophy, which is itself fascinating, a political theorist, a translator, a community and transnational activist who works on migration and refugees. Omid is the translator and collaborator with Behrouz Boochani's for his extraordinary account of the Australian detention regime, particularly on Manus Island, No Friend But the Mountains, which was published in Australia in 2017 and in the UK and in the US last year in 2019. The book is a major piece of writing, a major piece of literary writing, and a major piece of political theory, which I think, like all writing, the best writing that comes from the extremes of political life, invents new generic and creative forms to produce new types of knowledge. It's a kind of writing and thinking that challenges us at an extreme imaginative and creative, as well as political, moral, and ethical level. Omid, I wanted to start with that book. The book describes the detention regime on Manus as being like a Kyriarchal system. Can you explain what you mean by that term and how that works?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Lyndsey. It's great to be here, and I've been following your work for a while. So this issue, this theme, this concept of kyriarchy, I think, is really perfect for introducing Behrouz's book, because essentially the term that Behrouz uses in Farsi for what we call the Kyriarchal system in English. I say we because we came to that conclusion together. We decided that that's the best translation. But he uses this term in Farsi called Sistema Hakim. Now, Sistema Hakim, the word Hakim has Arabic roots, and it's used in Farsi. It's actually a transnational term. It's used in many different Islamic societies. And it means, it can be translated in numerous ways. Sovereign, it can be translated as Sistema Hakim, can be translated as sovereign system, controlling system, ruling system, governmental system, dominating system, oppressive system, subjugating system, ruling system. So there are so many ways that this one term can be translated, but none of these terms capture the essence of what Behrouz is saying when he talks about Sistema Hakim, and the way he tries to frame it and the way he explains it in the book, in particular, the contexts, the different situations, the individuals, the lived experiences that he associates it with. I started translating it as oppressive system originally, and after about 2 chapters maybe, I thought, no, I'm really uncomfortable with this. It's not right. And the reason is because what Behrouz is talking about when he uses this phrase is interlocking systems of oppression. But not just of interlocking systems of oppression, but domination and subjugation. It's a system that is designed and aims just to grind people down into submission. So its purpose, and it's willing to even sacrifice its own benefits, its own purpose, its own uses, or its own possibilities. It's willing to sacrifice a lot of those if this ultimate aim of crushing people, grinding people down into submission is fulfilled. On top of that, it's a system that multiplies itself. So it not only within the place where it's working, but beyond itself as well. So its whole initiatives, its aim is to create more like it. So it's replication and multiplication. So there are a whole range of different things that make it really unique, really idiosyncratic, I thought. Until I was thinking about a word to translate Sistema Hakim, and I look back to some of my research in the past, especially in the area of critical religious studies, and I came across the work of Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, and I remember she uses this term. She actually coined a term called kyriarchy, which Kyrios or Kyrios, it translates as Lord or Master. And she kind of brings this word together. It creates a new term, Kyriarchy, to explain systems of domination and control and subjugation and intersecting forms of discrimination that go beyond patriarchy. So for her, she wanted to critically reevaluate or ask us to rethink the notion of patriarchy to include other things like militarism, colonialism, um, different forms of discrimination like sexuality, race, class.
I mean, as I was reading the book, I was reminded of, as I so often am, of when Arendt is trying to describe where totalitarianism comes from. She says one of the elements is colonial practice. And in terms of Europe's history, it's what happened when colonialism boomeranged back. And when I was reading No Friend But the Mountain, I thought this shares a lot of her description of totalitarian systems. This shares a lot of, and part of that is the interlocking nature and the total domination. So it's not just, you have to get in people's minds, and that way you have to get them to reproduce the conditions of their own domination, which is, as Primo Levi said of the camps, is you kill the man inside. But also the utter pointlessness. And I think a lot of us who've worked with migration systems, whether it be in the UK or in Australia, have said at numerous points that this makes no sense. It's not a system that's working for itself. And then what really I thought the book and the idea of the Kyriarchal system brought home is it's not supposed to. It's actually not supposed to work. It's supposed to keep on reproducing itself. And in the sense of the regime on Manus, it's supposed to work to the point where you will voluntarily go back yourself, or sort of refoulement, but refoulement made voluntary by this sort of system of total domination that makes it unbearable to do anything else. They don't even do the instrumental thing that they're supposed to do because that's not what it's actually about.
It's not supposed to function in a way that's rational, that can be justified. The only justification is really just to force people to leave, to go back to the place where they fled, or to perish. It's kind of like a moral and an explanatory quagmire. The more you try to explain it using reason, using logic and analogies, using data, statistics, the more confusing the analysis becomes, the understanding becomes. And also, I think it's interesting that not only does it become more confusing, but the system constantly shifts. There's so much fluidity within it. And I think this is one of the reasons why legal approaches haven't been as successful as people expected, because laws change constantly. And laws are so open to interpretation and become so arbitrary. And I guess that also speaks to what you were saying about the fact that it's not supposed to be a well-oiled machine. It's supposed to be chaos.
But also that's sort of why I think your the kind of creative knowledge production approach is right. I mean, I'm trying to get you to say a bit more about that, because there's a way in which you can't fight this discourse on its own terms, because then you'll end up as mad as it's. Once you start buying into the logic, then you're already kind of caught within a kind of rationality and instrumentalism which is making no sense, and you're not opposing. Whereas what one of the very important things I think about the book and your work since is what happens if you put collaboration and translation at the heart of finding out, of finding ways to challenge. So that's one thing. But I was also reminded as you were talking, when you were talking about the law, I don't know if you saw the human rights lawyer Itamar Mann wrote a letter to the UN Chief Prosecutor of the UN using the book. Itamar Mann has worked on migration and refugees, to say, just as Primo Levi's If This Was a Man was at one point going to be used as evidence in the Eichmann trial. There are lots of reasons why it wasn't used in the end. This book is evidence against the new normal of degradation and dehumanization on the borders. And what I loved about that move, and I would love it because I'm a literary scholar, but I would love it for other reasons, is what happens if we actually step outside that kind of, the logic of reason, rationality, and law, defined by its own terms, to challenge those through different forms of creative knowledge production that might actually shift what we understand a crime to be, what we understand injustice to be.
Oh, there's so many points that you've highlighted. Unfortunately,
Sorry,
I won't have
it's
time
such
to. It's fantastic. I think, and I know Behrouz would be really thrilled by this conversation, because this is exactly the response, or the kind of response that he wanted for his book. And one of the things that he was really enthusiastic about was to transform the concept, the notion, the stereotypes associated with people who are experiencing displacement and exile, and breaking these dichotomies, or these binaries associated with victim and savior, beneficiary and benefactor, recipient and supporter, all these things that he was always uncomfortable with, and he believed that these particular kinds of assumptions, these reductions, are also part of that same system. And in order to really transform, in order to really deconstruct the system, in order to decolonize, it's not just the material conditions that need to be addressed, it's also the symbolic and also the epistemic. And I think that's where the creative approach really really hits home, really makes its impact. It's transforming the social imaginary, we could say the colonial imaginary. And I think that's one of the things that you pointed out, that is another central theme, along with kyriarchy. It's interdependent with the kyriarchal system, and that's the colonial logic. And how the detention centres in Australia are associated with Australia's colonial history. And I think thinking about border violence all over the world, we need to situate it within this framework, this historical framework, but also this ideological framework.
And of course, I mean, people don't like to hear this, but of course, certain forms of historical humanitarianism were also part of the colonial project. So people are quite happy with the idea of, the agentless refugee who needs help and who's testifying to his bitter experience, because that isn't actually a challenge to any kind of privilege or epistemology whatsoever. Which is why I think it's so interesting that the book is often, it's that refugee testimony thing. That's why I always introduce it as a major work of political theory and a major literary work. It's not, you're not having that, you're not having your passive refugee. Actually, thank you.
I like what you said about defying genres or challenging genres, because I also myself, in my reflections on the book and the translation process, I think about it as an anti-genre. It is political commentary, it is fiction, it is non-fiction, it is journalism, it's all these things. It's also myth and folklore and epic, and it's poetry at the same time. It's philosophical reflection. It's psychoanalytic examination. So basically, Behrouz is fusing all of these things together to really create something original, something new. But I think his purpose was for people to understand the soul of this system. And that soul of the system, and what that means is quite complex, and we can get into a discussion about that if there's time. But that's to understand not just the historical and transgenerational dimension to it, the colonial dimensions to it, but also to understand the future of this book, or the future of these crimes, which are represented in the book. So the soul of the system is something that. It's interesting. He talks about the soul as actually being, or the soul of the system as being conscious, as having agency. This move, this literary move, this creative move, I think is really important, because we start to think about the system as something that is planned, is designed. And it doesn't necessarily need one person or a group of people. It's actually part of the built environment, the natural environment. It's part of the social, political structures. It's part of culture, and it's part of history.
Thank you, Omid.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.